Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman, Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, May 28th, 2019, the day after Memorial Day. We took a little break yesterday, a little breather. Hope you joined us. Maybe you downloaded the podcast just to remember when. And it was appropriate that we spent Memorial Day memorializing last year's Memorial Day show, which we did live, and I considered coming right out with a live show again yesterday, and then realized, oh my God, what am I doing? You know, it was actually a good day to take a breather, considering that the, what's his name? The president guy was spending the weekend over in Japan, which was a little bit awkward. I mean, we thought about that, I think, just before we signed off on Friday and before he took off for Japan, that it's kind of a little bit of an awkward thing to do, right? To go to Japan to honor their new Japanese emperor, by the way, to sort of not necessarily, not in the strict definitional sense of paying homage, but going to visit the Japanese emperor on Memorial Day presents a ticklish diplomatic situation, except, you know, he doesn't do those. He doesn't even do regular diplomatic situations, as you may have seen, or either on this trip or any other. And to be spending time with the Japanese emperor, Memorial Day, photo war, etc. I mean, you know, those things are going to come up, and you're going to have to deal with them. I understand that he'll be, I know he's making a state visit to the UK, if it's still you, at the time, and it'll be in July, and I guess on July 4th, so we'll have to wait and see whether he wishes a happy July 4th to the Brits assembled when he's there. He wished a happy Memorial Day. That is a weird phrase. I know we have difficulty with it here in the United States. Do we wish people happy Memorial Day? I mean, a lot of people think of it as a happy summer holiday, and it kind of is one, but I don't know. It's always been a little bit weird, a little bit touchy. Depends on who you're talking to. Anyway, he was on board a Japanese naval vessel, which, you know, who has anything against Japanese naval vessels, right? Wishing everybody on board a happy Memorial Day. Thank you for, I guess, killing all our soldiers and sailors so that we could memorialize. I don't know. It was a very weird thing, and it required a deft touch. But of course, it was Donald Trump there, so instead he gave it a deft touch. And well, what can you do? It wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen, but whatever. So he spent the weekend having his fantasy trip to Japan. No sushi for him, of course. I noticed that the menu that was released by the White House for one of his dinners early in the weekend was about as American and bland as it could be. Potatoes, a baked potato with butter. I mean, I like that too. Some grilled chicken, some grilled steak, carrots and green beans and vegetables. You know, it's like pretty much not Japanese at all. Vanilla ice cream for dessert. Vanilla, because whatever. I don't know how many scoops the emperor got, or if he was even at that dinner. But then, of course, later in the weekend, some footage of him, coming out of the presidential limousine once again, leaving Melania behind, rushing up to shake the hand of the emperor, and then ignoring the emperor's wife entirely throughout the introductions until she finally sticks her hand out in a gesture, looking for a handshake. And, that he acknowledges. So, handshake it is. Well done. There was the sumo wrestling match, which we heard about early, I think prior to the weekend, that he was bringing over. Did we discuss it on Friday? I know I read early on that he was bringing a trophy of his own, a Trump-branded trophy. I finally did see the trophy. It didn't look obviously Trump-branded, but whatever. So he brought something over that he declared to be the President's Cup, which is an actual thing in golf, but not in sumo, at least not until now. And he sort of hoped that it would become such a thing. I don't know. I mean, it's entirely possible that they might pass this thing on. Yeah, whoever beats this, I don't know how sumo wrestling works. I mean, in terms of standings and championships, etc. But all right, so he presented this trophy. It was a rather large trophy. Of course, these are rather large guys, so it had to be a big trophy. And by the way, huge mistake. No pun intended about huge mistake by Trump to put himself next to sumo wrestlers for whom stats, vital statistics are readily available online. We found out the name of the wrestler to whom he was presenting the trophy, and of course, took a screenshot or two from the video of the two of them together. And well, the old saw about Trump being 6'3" and 239 pounds. I think he now acknowledges 242 pounds. Well, he's standing next to this sumo wrestler, and, the stats are available on this guy. He doesn't look that much bigger than this guy, and this guy comes in at 6'1.5". It's a little more difficult to judge the height as between them, given the angle that we've got. 6'1.5", but 390 pounds. And to be honest, if you put a suit on that guy, I don't know how much bigger than Donald Trump he looks. So 239, 242 are just like out of the question for Donald Trump. But you knew that. Anyway, so that's the story on his trip to Japan so far. I'm sure I'm missing something. By the way, I did learn something over the weekend, too, as I was getting ready to thank Shinzō Abe, Prime Minister of Japan, for babysitting our boy for the weekend. I learned through our media, actually through their media, well, through our media, too. They told our media to tell us that he is Abe Shinzō. Probably those of you more familiar with Japanese and East Asian cultures knew that already and always wondered, why do we do, that's the way Americans do things. We like to put the given name first and then the familial name last, and we never really got used to, although we got used to it with Chinese and, for instance, with the Koreans as well, Kim Jong-un, Kim Il-sung, whatever it was, all the Kims, that's the family name. Shinzō Abe is Abe Shinzō in the Japanese expression of it, but they actually put out a press notice that they would like Western media to begin referring to him that way. So sorry about all previous references to Shinzō Abe, even though I think Donald likes to call him Shinzo, which is nice. It's familiar. I don't know how well received it is there in Japan, but I guess we'll make a mental note of that and forget it later on. Abe Shinzō, our apologies. Thanks for taking care of our boy. Feel free to stop at any time and send him back when we don't want him back, but I can't force you to keep him, though it would be most welcome if you wanted to. I understand also, let's see, I saw a tweet in Japanese, which was very interesting to see the Japanese characters on Twitter and use the translation function. I guess the Prime Minister took him along in an effort to give him a little bit of an education on the Japanese relationship with North Korea. And I also believe that while he was there, there were more missile launches from the North Koreans while he was there. Trump pretty much blew them off and said, "Don't worry about it. I'm good friends with Kim Jong-un, and everything will be fine. This is just something he does from time to time," which is actually very frightening to the Japanese. And I don't know if they really, I don't know, maybe they like being reassured. The Japanese are acting kind of funny about Donald Trump, and I can't tell how much of it is authentic, how much of it is bots on Twitter, etc. But back to the Twitter item I saw over the weekend. It was Abe Shinzō bringing Donald Trump with him to sit down and listen to the stories of families who have had family members abducted by the North Koreans, like currently, not way back during World War II or anything like that, but currently. And they were in their best possible way, with their best foot forward. Abe Shinzō himself had tweeted that he was impressed by Trump's ability to sit and seriously consider the stories, which is sort of the minimum basic requirement. But for Donald Trump, that's a big deal. And I don't know. I don't know whether it made any impact or went in one ear and out the other. But I guess that's the subtlest way, I guess, the Japanese could come up with to let him know that the North Koreans not all good. I mean, we all know that, but you know how Trump is. He gets it in his mind that he's friends with Kim Jong-un and the guy can do no wrong anymore. So that was kind of interesting. Many other stories, I'm sure. I know at least 5 just occurred to me while I was telling that story, but none all that important. In fact, the major point for me of the trip overseas was that it kept things relatively quiet. They played some golf, fine. You know, you're not allowed to follow him around at that on the golf course anyway, so that's like a news blackout. He's tweeting, you know, doing his regular rage tweeting thing, and there's the added aspect of his launching political attacks while he's overseas on a state visit, but we've long since given up on that tradition for Trump anyway. And so, you know, no major surprises, I guess. That's kind of good news. Oh, yes, right. There's the Trump blowing off of the North Korean missile testing, which I thought was interesting, and that he had a very presidential take on things, of course, saying that some of my advisors think this is a violation of, I think, was a UN Security Council resolution forbidding such tests, and some of my advisors thinks this puts Kim in violation of this resolution, but I don't know. I don't think so. I think, and he puts his heart and soul into this analysis, he might be just looking for attention, which he immediately followed up with the fantastic comment, or he might not, or perhaps not. He might be looking for attention, or perhaps not. Who knows? Which, like, wow. I don't know. I mean, you'd want maybe a more definitive read on things from the President of the United States. But then again, it's Donald Trump. You're just not going to get it. That's the way he approaches everything. And there are people who think that sounds smart and like cautious and considered, which is kind of amazing. But that's what we get by way of presidential analysis these days. It could be one thing, or, you know, perhaps not. Who knows? We'll see. 2 weeks. We'll find out exactly what happened. Okay. So, a little bit of a roundup will be necessary. We'll have to flip through the tweets from the weekend and pocket and see what's important. Usually the heavy stuff goes in pocket. So let's go and take a peek at that first, and then we'll scroll through. Having done the lightning round of the light stuff, we'll come back to that later on. Okay, let's see. Here's an interesting note. Not on the Donald Trump front, just for a slight change of pace. I did see this circulated yesterday. BuzzFeed News, Dan Vergano picking this news up. Scientists, ready scientists? Scientists showed how more guns led to more violent crime. Oh no, remember more guns, less crime? It didn't work. A Supreme Court case may soon create a constitutional right to freely carry a gun everywhere. Are we waiting on something like that? But that would be a dangerous mistake to make, suggests a new study on violent crimes. Let's take a look at this piece. This was from middle of last week, which we somehow missed when it was immediately released. Oh, look at this guy. Oh, it's a woman holding this gun. You can say, well, either that or a guy with Dracula fingernails. Got all the dangerous accessories here. There's a silencer on this pistol, but also one of those, as they love to say, tactical flashlights, which apparently create a huge issue for accidental discharge. But okay, good luck. What do we have here? Right to carry handgun laws trigger a 13 to 15% increase in violent crime a decade after the typical state adopts them, suggests a new statistical analysis of 33 states. They didn't analyze all of them, but maybe those are the ones with right to carry laws. I'm not sure. The Journal of Empirical Legal Studies, my favorite journal. starting now. Report was released on Monday in this journal. It's the latest in a thorny academic fight, as they say, over how letting people more freely carry around guns affects those crimes. That was a really difficult sentence to read. It was very awkward. How awkwardly put is that? How letting people more freely carry around guns affects those crimes. It's perfectly serviceable. It just doesn't roll trippingly, let's say. Advocacy for and against looser gun laws will doubtless grow louder as the U.S. Supreme Court is expected to hear a challenge to a ban on taking a licensed handgun outside New York City limits without a permit. Its first gun control case in nearly a decade. Okay. I guess they're right about that. The court split along partisan lines 5-4 in favor of judges who have previously favored expanded gun rights could decide that there is a constitutional right to carry a gun outside the home. They got damn close to that as it is. But that was 2008, was it, that we were thinking of? All right, well, anyway. Moving on here. But that could be a dangerous mistake to make, according to the new study's lead author, Stanford Law School's John Donahue. The important takeaway is that more guns seems to lead to more crime. It's almost as if guns attract crime, as I like to say. Donahue told BuzzFeed News by email, so it's probably wise to think in terms of appropriate controls, and it would be very unwise to push the Second Amendment too far. This long-running and contentious statistical debate began with the 1998 book More Guns, Less Crime by John Lott Jr. of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Good job being wrong there, John. Since its publication, 11 states have loosened right-to-carry laws, and more than 30 states now allow the open carrying of a gun without a permit. Did you know that? Up to 30 states, no permit at all, just put it on your hip. It's concealed that needs the permit. That's very interesting. Why is that exactly? You would think that open, I don't know, maybe let's ponder it for a little while. Open carry seems certainly more flamboyant and obvious. And I guess the thinking originally was, well, if you want people to carry concealed so that it's not obvious that that person is armed. And I don't know, I guess you need to have certain kind of but the training is in the mechanics of the use of the gun, not in how to, exercise restraint before using the gun. It seems to me like, I don't know, maybe the open carry should require more permitting somehow than the concealed carry. But that's not the case. We do it backwards for whatever reason. About 3.1 million people in the U.S. were victims of violent crimes, rapes, robberies, and assaults in 2017, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. In the new study, statisticians looked at right-to-carry laws' effects on those numbers by adding data from the 11 states that have adopted them in the last 15 years to create a record of 33 states that allowed citizens to carry concealed weapons from 1981 to 2007. Okay. The team looked at violent crime rates in all of the states, controlling statistically for the effects of policing, incarceration rates, poverty, and other demographic trends to estimate the changes caused by the right-to-carry laws. You never know how accurately they're going to be able to do that. It was really only after we had 14 more years of data and 11 additional adoptions of RTC, right-to-carry laws, that a clear picture emerged that RTC laws increase violent crime, Donahue said. Well, they certainly took their time at getting at it, so I guess they must have done it carefully. Or they're just procrastinators. I'm not sure which. For 23 of the 31 states adopting the laws, the increase in violent crime was large. For example, in Pennsylvania, where they cling to their guns, right? Up more than 24% in 10 years, while it's on the decline nationwide. Everyone should probably keep that in mind. And up by nearly 17% in Texas, where they were going to shoot you in the face if you even look at them wrong, right? In South Dakota, the results suggest a right-to-carry law led to a 1.6% drop in violent crime rates after a decade. So good luck and congratulations, rather, to South Dakota on that one. I'm sure they controlled for it, but may have had something to do with everybody saying, why don't we get the hell out of South Dakota and go somewhere else? To jail all the people committing these added violent crimes, by the way, The average state would need to double its prison population, the analysis concludes. That sounds like fun. The study cataloged recent road rage disputes, bar fights, police shootings of armed civilians, and everyday vitriol that turned into shootings in right-to-carry states. That's true. To suggest mechanisms that explain how the increases might happen. The study didn't find a statistically significant change in the rates of homicides or property crimes. So very interesting. And I'm sure that John Lott would say, well, look at homicide. That's the crime that people associate with gun issues, right? Well, no apparent increase there. But instead, the increase is in, and this is a great point, and something we have brought up in considering gun fail stories for a long time. The presence of a gun very often escalates verbal confrontation to physical assault. And that's a crime. That's a problem where, people arguing over a parking space would just yell at each other. Now they're drawing guns on one another and you've got an assault on your hands. The number of crime scholars contacted by BuzzFeed News praised the finding as the most complete accounting yet for the violent crime effects of letting more people carry around guns. It's interesting because I think the pro-gun side of it thought that the anti-gun side, or pro-gun safety if you prefer, I think they thought that people who were against loosening gun laws thought that people who were armed would just start committing crimes. Like, I have a gun now, so it's time for me to do some crimes, which was always ridiculous. And I think they knew that, they may even have known that we didn't really believe that, but they thought that they could convince other pro-gun people to think that about anti-gun, I guess, people. And so they ran with it, even though the problem was more along the lines of, well, having guns on people emboldens them, and they escalate ordinary confrontations into assaults and possibly batteries as well. And that's the real problem, is that people tend to resort to the gun a lot faster when they're readily available. And I think you really should have been able to predict that even on the pro-gun side. But they needed to deny that for their political agenda. Okay, back to the article here. I have read the study and consider it to be the most rigorous of studies of right-to-carry laws to date. Daniel Webster, we've heard that name before, yeah. Director of the Center for Gun Policy and Research at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, wrote to BuzzFeed News in an email. Given state legislative and federal court battles over these laws, he said this is a very important piece of research. The more guns, less crime estimate in the 90s didn't factor in the levels of police and imprisonment in each state, which the new study found grew significantly after passage of right-to-carry laws, and helps explain their disagreeing conclusions. Lott, however, was strongly dismissive of the study. Of course, it's his entire reason for being. Questions that, arguing that the bulk of reports over the last 2 decades have supported his findings, or found no effect on violent crime rates. Basically, poor areas are more likely to be affected by violent crime, so lowering barriers to permits has a bigger effect in states that do so, Lott told BuzzFeed News. I'm not even sure what that means. An effect he said the new study didn't account for. Poor areas more likely to be affected by violent crime. Lowering barriers to permits has a bigger effect on states that do. That still doesn't make any sense. He complained that more right-to-carry studies than his, finding no effect or reduced crime rates, have gotten no news coverage. However, Duke University criminologist Philip Cook told BuzzFeed News that a new study with better methods and data toppling an old incorrect theory is just an example of how science works. I like that. Put very simply. Good job, Philip Cook. The scientific process does not always get the right answer the first time. But if it's working well, then important findings are reviewed and tested and the truth becomes clearer, said Cook, in the case of the newer, better study of 33 states. Regardless, he added, advocates for the more guns, less crime idea will likely continue beating the drum for right-to-carry laws. So it doesn't get in their way at any point. They're not interested in science anyway, and even if they were, they would just claim that this study was improperly conducted. And there's always room to critique those studies. But I thought I'd put that one out there and share it with you. And I think it's an important development, and I think it really reflects a common sense view of what introducing more guns, particularly without permitting or training of any kind, is likely to do for our crime rates. And once you realize that just pulling, that's probably something that doesn't enter into the thinking of most people in general, but certainly most gun rights advocates as well. They view pulling out a gun in what they think is a threatening situation and defusing it by scaring the crap out of the other person is a good thing. That's not a crime. That's avoiding a crime. The crime was that guy was going to assault me, and now he isn't going to because I produced a weapon in self-defense. But what you actually did, of course, was assault the other person with a deadly weapon. And it depends on, I guess, how rich you are and what kind of lawyer you can afford. But essentially it comes down to your story that you were just walking along minding your own business when this other person assaulted you and you leapt to your own defense with a gun, and their story that you were having an argument about something and there was no assault involved until you pulled a gun. You say you were preventing an assault. I say you initiated the assault. And let's see what the jury says. And apparently the jury very often says, you're the one that has initiated the assault in this case. And I'm sorry, but you're the guilty party here. And you have increased our crime statistics, which probably is at bottom what ended up driving gun rights advocates to start pushing for stand your ground laws. They didn't want to have to submit the case to a jury in the first place. Guns are good. Leave us alone. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And hopefully we didn't get cut off before our break. I was talking extensively about this, but I think we've hit on an important point here about the new gun study and its relation, or I guess the logic underlying the hypothesis that more guns might equal more crime, and the origin of stand your ground laws. I have a feeling that the push for stand your ground laws, one, was grounded in, no pun intended, grounded in their astonishment early on at finding out, if not anticipating, that the gun carriers who resorted to the, in their minds, the protection, the self-defense of their guns in situations that previously were never regarded as warranting the drawing of a weapon at all, and in which a weapon would likely never have been drawn in the first place because of the barriers to everyday gun carriage, I don't know, that previously existed, just prevented these things from happening. But if an argument in a parking lot over a parking space escalates to the point where one party, according to their story, feels threatened enough that they would end up drawing a gun, you're probably going to get in court when you test this thing out. One person who says, I was assaulted with a gun. We were arguing about a parking space and nothing was, wasn't escalating to the point where any violence really was threatened. And then one person who knows that the magic words are, I felt threatened, and will start saying, I felt threatened, and basically alleging that the other person assaulted them verbally and that they responded in self-defense, and finding out that that doesn't always work, or if there are other witnesses who say, no, the more belligerent guy, as it turns out, was the guy with the gun. And that fits with some of our psychological profiling, admittedly, I guess, ungrounded in hard data, but anecdotal anyway, or just basic common sense that sometimes you see people argue about these things all the time. And people who are unarmed and often assume that the other person is likewise unarmed sometimes respond differently to an escalation of an argument than somebody who knows that if things get out of control, they can always go to the gun, or if they, just as important here is the feeling that they'll be justified in going to the gun, and that most people, they will think, approach guns and the use of guns the same way in their minds. They see this as the mythical defensive gun use, the DGU that John Lott is always going on about, that defensive gun use prevents so many crimes in this country. But a lot of those crimes, I think, are possibly imaginary, though they try and turn them into documented crimes by alleging at trial that they were acting in self-defense. But they probably found early on that it didn't always work, and that most people were still of the mindset that there ought not to be readily available guns for everyone, and that pulling a gun over a parking space was an absurdity, if not an atrocity. And they were getting themselves convicted in situations where they were even making formal pleas of self-defense. And so I think they then began trying to devise laws like the Stand Your Ground laws that would make it a matter of public policy that you should be able to resort to the gun early on, that guns are a good thing to resort to because they close down the situation very quickly. But that only works for people who, A, have the guns with them, and B, who believe a certain thing about the guns. It never occurs to them that the rest of society might view that as an assault, which it is, to simply produce a gun. Now, just because you felt threatened doesn't mean you were threatened. You could be a terribly paranoid individual, or you could just be a gun enthusiast who's read a lot of articles that say, I felt threatened, worked somewhere as magic words, and you should be able to do them here too, especially if you've successfully lobbied your state to pass a Stand Your Ground law, and it actually says somewhere that if you say you felt threatened, that's supposed to work. Not only is it supposed to work as an affirmative defense at trial, it's supposed to work as an affirmative defense pre-trial and get your case dismissed, that there would be no grounds to go forward with a charge against you if you said these magic words ahead of time, which is an extraordinarily broad application of the theory here. And it's an interesting issue that I guess, it's a real issue in terms of collecting these statistics. And I suppose it explains not only, of course, the proliferation of these laws, but the continuing debate. You'd think there can only be one truth here. Either there's increased crime or there isn't, right? But one side is working with one definition of crime. What's on the books? What have the police reported investigating? What have they made arrests for? What do the court records say, etc.? Whereas on the other side, they say, I don't care what the police think a crime was. I think this here was a defensive gun use and an attempt to reduce crime. The FBI's official reports say it was a crime, but why should it be a crime? Let's legislate it such that it won't be. And then we'll have the statistics that we need to prove that crime is lower. It's just that we've taken an entire category of crimes, assaults with a deadly weapon, and erased them from the books as an offense. That didn't reduce crime. That just redefined a certain kind of crime as not crime anymore because, I don't know, because I've got a gun. Might makes right. So there you go. I don't know. That's a really complicated issue, and you could probably spend a lot longer than we're going to spend on it. Well, today anyway. And then I will say I have spent that time. So I guess I just wanted to call back to that old stuff. That's a really interesting thing, and I'll bet there's a book to be written by somebody who's willing to do serious research and writing on that subject. That person is not me. However, you can send me all the royalties. How about that? Okay. I just spit out the ideas, and you guys go and capitalize them. This is a great program for those of you who are interested in writing books. I'll just give you some ideas. You go do it. Okay. What else have we got here? Lots of other stuff happening over the weekend. Most of it's still relating to Trump, because, of course, he puts himself at the center of everything. Let's see. Nothing much more to do with the Japan trip, I guess. Of course, we ended last weekend with the particular outrage of Trump and others reiterating their theory that all who oppose Trump, particularly those who believe in the Trump-Russia story, which is a giant witch hunt and hoax, are guilty of treason. Of course, treason being punishable by death in this country. They ought to be executed, and P.S., we wouldn't mind very much if some members of the public helped us out with that, more than likely. But in addition, they're continuing in the White House to make the case, well, I mean, they think they're making the case, that all the investigation is going to be a waste of time anyway. We already know that everybody's guilty. There was a comment from Sarah Sanders. I happen to have The Hill's reporting about it here because The Hill are fantastic shills for their product and get these headlines in front of me all the time. They do a great job of it, even if they do sometimes a lousy job of reporting. Sarah Sanders, quoted here, "We already know that there was an outrageous amount of corruption at the FBI. No need for an investigation, except, I guess, to formalize it. Bill Barr will take care of that," is the idea. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, for some reason they don't underline and link the Sanders part here, said Sunday the Trump administration already, that's in quote, already, knows that there was a high level of corruption at the FBI ahead of Attorney General William Barr's investigation into the origins of the Russia investigation. We already know that there was an outrageous amount of corruption that took place at the FBI, not the New York office, where there actually was some, and it was anti-Clinton. We won't look at that. They leaked information. They lied. They were specifically working to take down the president, trying to hurt the president, Sanders said on NBC's Meet the Press, which was just amazing because I think at some point Chuck Todd made a big deal out of not having idiotic liars on his show going forward, but then he went ahead and did this one anyway for some strange reason. So, of course, by the way, they have a very interesting play going on here. Donald Trump is purported to be the president now, and so they speak of him as the president, but of course they're talking about activity that took place during the campaign where he wasn't the president, but they say they were trying to take down the president, trying to hurt the president. That's treason. It isn't, but we think we can get away with saying it's treason because president, head of country, treason, therefore, you get the idea here. But of course, taking on a candidate like that, it's clearly it's not treason. The guy isn't president yet. It's a lousy thing to do if it actually happens, and it undermines our democracy. Perhaps if if everything that they're alleging is true, but what it isn't is an attack on the country. It's just an attack on a guy that says he wants to run for president of that country, and, that's not the same thing. Anyway, she blathered on by saying, we'll leave the final call up to the Attorney General, and he'll get to the bottom of it, but we think Americans deserve the truth. The president's asked for that, and we should expect nothing less. Host Chuck Todd pushed back. Wow, look out. Noting that it sounds like the president has already determined the outcome. That was actually the definition of the words that she said, but it doesn't sound like you want him to do his job, Todd added, referring to Barr. Chuck, that's the reason he's granted the Attorney General the authority to declassify that information. To look at all the documents necessary is so that we can get to the very bottom of what happened, Sanders responded. That's not actually a response. It looks like you've reached a predetermined conclusion. Chuck, we want to have documents for our conclusion. Oh, okay. Once again, we already know about some wrongdoing. No, you don't. The president's not wrong in that. Yes, he is. But he wants to know everything that happened and how far it went and how wide it went. Let's see. This, of course, stems from Trump having given Barr new authority to examine and possibly release classified material related to the Justice Department's inquiry into the origins of the Russia investigation. The president and his allies have suggested that federal agents biased against him improperly initiated special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. It's just that the timeline doesn't actually hold up to that allegation, so whatever. But it's out there and important. And in addition to having an assassination list, he now insists that that FBI agents are going to have to be on that list because I've concluded that they did this thing, and Barr is going to conduct a investigation to prove it. Just, it's a little backwards, but okay. By the way, speaking of his public enemies list, let's just lean on someone else's more organized thoughts about the subject as soon as we get rid of all the pop-ups in the way of it. Daily Beast's David Lurie, Lurie, has produced this piece last week. Trump's public enemies list is itself an impeachable offense. Yes. What he and William Barr are doing is potentially worse than anything in the Mueller report. And yes, please do remember every once in a while to exercise that thought for yourself and express it to someone else. The Mueller report is not nearly the full extent of Trump's impeachable offenses. It covers only one small slice of the activity for which he could be impeached and ought to be impeached. So, over to this other slice here. Long before becoming president, Donald Trump called for the jailing of his adversaries. Aided by Attorney General William Barr, he may now actually be training the full force of federal law enforcement against his enemies, real or perceived. Unlike Richard Nixon, who acted in secret, Trump is corrupting the justice system openly and publicly, which is something George W. Bush did too, but for some reason we all forgot about, and maybe it has something to do with now Democrats in good standing having staked their reputation at the time on insisting that, no, he isn't doing that, and you're all paranoid. And the seriousness of such a presidential abuse of power and its potential for undermining the constitutional order could well surpass any of the crimes detailed in the Mueller report. Indeed, the Congress long ago recognized that such misconduct can merit impeachment. Trump's desire to investigate the investigators who uncovered the Russian plot to elect him president has taken on a very special urgency. Oops, I added a very. Since the release of the Mueller report, with Trump repeatedly accusing government officials of treason, and the White House declaring this whole thing was a takedown attempt at the President of the United States, which he wasn't. On Thursday night, after Trump had spent days excoriating the purportedly treasonous investigators by name, he announced he had granted Barr the full and complete authority to declassify documents relating to the Russia probe. The White House also stated that Trump had directed intelligence agencies to quickly and fully cooperate with the investigation into the investigation. I don't know whether they mentioned it later on in here, but it was a great piece of video of him saying, saying that he was giving Barr the authority to declassify things, then claiming he had already declassified thousands of pages himself and that he didn't have any idea what was in them. He just knew that they were important and Barr could look at them and decide which ones to release. But of course, if they've been declassified, we should have them all. But he didn't do it. And I found myself, once again, the only one over the weekend reminding everybody that with Donald Trump, you must see the paperwork on these things. I assume that something was shown to the press about, for instance, this order authorizing William Barr to do this declassification act. But I haven't seen it. I assume they showed something to the press, and that was the basis of the reporting. But it hasn't been authenticated as far as I know, and it's not something that the press typically does, go through the authentication process. Did they, some of it, of course, is absurd, or would be absurd under normal circumstances. Did you witness, did anybody witness Donald Trump signing this thing? Is it even something that needs to be signed? Can it just be put out as an unsigned memorandum or directive? If so, have you seen it? If so, do you know if it was vetted in any way by OLC people? Once again, you can't be sure just because he says it that he did it. And I haven't seen the paper on it. I wouldn't shock me if there was some paper, but it would shock me if anybody checked the provenance of that paper and whether or not it really checked out. It could end up just being another thing where Trump said he intended to do a thing or had done such a thing, and later on the White House has to backfill with paper. But I'm curious why nobody goes to that as the first inclination. My first inclination when he says that is, I don't think you did it. I'd like to see the order. And even if you show it to me, I would insist that I see some sort of evidence that you actually signed it and understood it. I mean, you just gave me the soundbite that said you didn't know how could you do that? I declassified a bunch of things that I don't even know what's in it. And then Barr will choose whether or not to release it. It should all be available now as under Freedom of Information Act. It's declassified. You said you declassified it. And it's been the claim in the George W. Bush administration that that's all it took was for the president to declare it declassified. Now, if he doesn't know what's in it, but he declassified it, are we sure it's declassified at that point? I mean, if he has no knowledge of, is there paperwork somewhere saying I declassify pages X through Y of whatever compendium there is? Then he would not have any idea what was in it, but would officially have, I would accept that as an official declassification. But do we even have such a thing? Once again, we skip right over that. We just assume that when a president says he's done something, he's done it, which is ridiculous with this guy. All right, back to the article. It's all reminiscent of Nixon's secret scheme to, quote, use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies, unquote, as then White House counsel John Dean put it, by manipulating grant availability, federal contract, litigation, prosecution, etc. Dirty stuff. Nixon directed the IRS to provide potentially damaging information against some of his enemies. What an idea. Although the agency's commissioner refused Nixon's demand, the scheme became part of the impeachment case against Nixon, which accused him of illegally endeavoring to obtain information from the IRS in violation of the constitutional rights of citizens. While much of Nixon's scheme was forestalled, Trump appears poised to effectuate his. Barr recently named Connecticut U.S. Attorney John Durham, best known for investigating the FBI's corrupt relationship with Boston mobster James Whitey Bulger, to head up an inquiry into the, quote, origins of the Russia investigation. Unnamed government officials have attempted to minimize the significance of the inquiry by stating to the press that it does not currently entail the use of grand jury subpoenas, but that, of course, could change at any time. Indeed, Senator Lindsey Graham is publicly demanding as much. Barr, meanwhile, has become remarkably open about his intent to follow the president's lead by making the investigators the focus of as much opprobrium as possible. In his Senate testimony several weeks ago, Barr denied endorsing the president's accusation that there was improper surveillance of the Trump campaign. More recently, however, He responded to a Fox News interviewer's question whether he smelled a rat at the FBI by stating, "I don't know if I'd describe it as a rat. I would just say that the answers that I'm getting are not sufficient." I smell a weasel. How about that? In the same interview, Barr emphasized that officials at the highest levels of the FBI and other agencies were involved, in a plain allusion to James Comey and the other former high-level law enforcement and intelligence officials that Trump has reportedly excoriated. Trump's initial target was Hillary Clinton. Trump implored Jeff Sessions, ultimately with some success, to reopen an investigation into unsubstantiated claims that she had improperly interfered in the sale of a uranium mining concern, Uranium One, to a Russian company as Secretary of State. In November of 2017, the New York Times called 10 former attorneys general, but only one responded to its question whether Sessions should accede to Trump's loud demands. Who was that one that responded? It was Barr, who said he saw no problem with the president training the sights of the Department of Justice on a political enemy as long as it was warranted. Barr even opined that the evidence against Clinton was stronger than any potential evidence of wrongdoing by the president, despite the fact that primary evidence for the Uranium One allegations came from a book sponsored by Steve Bannon. I wonder if the Steve Bannon character was connected with the campaign in any way. Barr seemed unconcerned with the risk posed by a president employing the Justice Department as a mechanism for exacting revenge against former electoral opponents. Indeed, Barr declared the department would be, quote, abdicating its responsibility, unquote, if it did not pursue Clinton as Trump desired. What do you think of that? That's pretty interesting. You're abdicating your responsibility. It's irresponsible not to speculate. So you're abdicating your responsibility in not so speculating. In a memorandum he later wrote to the DOJ officials overseeing Mueller and shared with Trump's defense team before becoming Attorney General, magically enough, Barr asserted that there is, quote, no limit on the president's authority to direct the course of law enforcement investigations, including those he is personally interested in. How odd. It seems at odds with the opinions of almost everybody else in the country. In fact, Trump's effort to undermine the legitimacy of the now completed Russia investigation is part and parcel of Trump's earlier efforts to limit and even terminate the investigation while it was ongoing, conduct that the Mueller report identified as potential obstruction of justice, and that Trump, with Barr's support, as asserted, merely amounted to, quote, fighting back. I guess in some ways a parallel to drawing a gun on people in a parking lot argument. I'm just fighting back. I'm standing my ground. I have a legal right to be here. Barr suggested to the Times that there is just no problem with the president personally selecting who should or shouldn't become the subjects of criminal investigations as long as the facts warrant inquiries. But that entirely misses the point. As the nation recognized during the Watergate era, if the president employs the apparatus of the federal government to single out and punish political or personal enemies by making them the focus of law enforcement investigations, the perception and the reality of fairness on which our justice system depends will be gravely endangered. And so it is. And that is actually the conclusion of the article. It comes to a rather blunt halt on a very good point. But, well, the point having been made, there's no point in continuing on at that point, if you will. That was kind of awkward. Okay, speaking of Bannon, New York Times article reports from over, the end of last week. Bannon's populists, once a movement, now keep him at arm's length. That sounds interesting, and I like to hear that. Although, really, when we get to maybe tomorrow, when we're back on the air with Greg Dworkin, he has a keen interest in rounding up Brexit news, and we can maybe, no one seems to be able to get a handle on the European Parliament elections and what developed there. Some very strange results individually and collectively as well. But let's take a look at this Bannon article before taking a break again in our next exit from the program. Bannon's populists wants a movement, keep him at arm's length, by Adam Nossiter and Jason Horowitz, a May 24th piece in the New York Times, datelined Paris. Stephen K. Bannon, the millionaire former Trump advisor, thanks for throwing that in there, turned rabble-rouser and General Schlump, rabble-rouser of European populists, settled into a plush set of rooms this week in Paris at the Bristol Hotel, where suites run up to $32,000 a night because of his populism. An unopened bottle of champagne in front of him, he presented himself as a man of the people and promoted Europe's right-wing and populist parties even as voting was underway for the European Parliament. The most important election in Europe, he said in an interview on Thursday. For months, Mr. Bannon has traveled around Europe presenting himself as the linchpin of a populist revolution. But he was in Paris as nothing more than an advisor-counselor to Marine Le Pen, the far-right nationalist leader. These people don't need my help, Mr. Bannon said. And by the way, Le Pen turns out to have done dismayingly well in the elections. That was good because they no longer seem to want his help either. How interesting. All week in Paris, Mr. Bannon was hissed at by enemies, dominated the airwaves, and caused an eruption in the French political class for meddling in the country's affairs. He was kept at arm's length by allies, perhaps most surprisingly, even by those from the far right, whom he has tried for months to pound into a Europe-wide populist rebellion. I think they just thought it was best for their optics if they stayed away from him, but they clearly were interested in the message. These elections, taking place from Thursday to Sunday, were the big moment when Mr. Bannon predicted that his assembled forces would storm the barricades of the European Union bureaucracy, except that now that it has arrived, many of them seem to have moved on without him. So we'll check in on the results of those probably a little closer tomorrow. And I think they did, in fact, in some places gain some leverage. In others, they lost it. It's a very confusing situation, probably not to the Europeans who are listening. And so we might want to lean on you for a little bit of commentary on that front, too. We'll continue a little bit later after this break with this article and perhaps a little more about those elections, if we can dig up good stuff. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And BJ Hutch already on the case here. What is this? Oh, somebody must have... Okay, somebody photoshopped something ridiculous with Trump in it. And never mind that. We're getting distracted here. But what is she sent us here? This is much needed good news. The EU elections green wave, it says, is set to transform energy policy. There were some very mixed results, certainly, and by location. In some places, the far right made some gains. In others, they were wiped off the map. So we really have to kind of round things up here. But let's continue with the Steve Bannon place setter here. Mr. Bannon's presence in France had become so toxic that Ms. Le Pen, the leader of the former National Front, rebranded as the National Rally, that's wise, did not meet him. She told the French news media that he, quote, was playing no role in the campaign, unquote. He's probably claiming credit for some of these successes now, though. Though Mr. Bannon did meet with some of her associates at the Bristol for a year in often similarly lush hotels across Europe, in Italy, Britain, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, Mr. Bannon had promised polling for his far-right fellow travelers. He promised to hook populist parties up with financiers. He promised experts in campaign data mining. He promised a global clubhouse based in an associate's Brussels mansion. Oh, like the one he used to maintain in Washington and maybe still does. All I'm trying to be, Mr. Bannon said in a March interview in the Hotel Grand Savoia in Milan, is the infrastructure globally for the global populist movement. Only just trying to be the nucleus of the whole thing. Okay. No alarms go off there. Let's see. What did this remind me of as I was reading something? Oh, yes, right. So there's a tweet storm or two on the subject. Okay, let's see. But in the home stretch before the elections, a distance began to grow. This month, Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Anti-Immigrant League Party and one of Mr. Bannon's earliest recruits, held a rally in Milan of European populists, including Ms. Le Pen. In many ways, by the way, I like that sort of pan-European globalism to own the globalists, right? In many ways, it seemed the manifestation of the movement Mr. Bannon had been prophesizing in his endless media scrums, but Mr. Bannon was not there. "We don't need him," Jörg Meuthen, a leader of the far-right Alternative for Germany party, said after the rally. The reasons Mr. Bannon is not needed now have much to do with the contradictions of his nationalist internationale, as critics call his movement. Yes, see? Okay, they can see it too. I'm glad. From the start, it was an incongruous effort by an outsider to stitch together far-right nationalists who all give pride of place to their own countries. Beyond watering down the European Union, the common interest of a bunch of leaders all wanting to put their own country first don't always easily coincide. But his populists have also quickly internalized Mr. Bannon's most important lesson, that media attention creates its own political momentum. And for a while, Mr. Bannon brought that media attention with him wherever he went. He showered it on the European populists, and in return they gave him a new battlefield, one where he was not a casualty. He had been fired by President Trump, but a player, and where he could get more press for himself. Small wonder. "I'm just an American in Paris," Mr. Bannon said as he held court at the Bristol, grinning at the obvious understatement. He declined to reveal how much he had paid for his set of rooms, because he didn't pay anything. Somebody else paid for that. I guess the Mercers did. Denied that it contradicted his Tribune of the People persona, and insisted that the looks was really all about, quote, efficiency, you see. Yet the stormy reaction to Mr. Bannon's presence in Paris this week spoke volumes about a delicate moment he has helped create in America's relations with Europe generally, and with France especially. The presidency of Mr. Trump, his former boss, who remains deeply unpopular in France, has infused the old alliance with insecurity and bitterness. Much of the ruckus that accompanied Mr. Bannon this week was based on a mutual misunderstanding. His lack of French gives him a sometimes shaky comprehension of local political life, and the French often have an equally fantastic notion of American politics. Still, it all seemed a far cry from Mr. Bannon's oft-staged grand design to engineer the Federation of Europe's far right. Even he barely spoke a word of it during an hour-plus interview. "The idea of my being here as some kind of puppet master, it's just not true," he said. "I don't talk to the president," he said of Mr. Trump, and called Ms. Le Pen just a personal friend and colleague. Yet if Mr. Bannon's goals were disruption and attention, he had richly succeeded, though possibly at the expense of his erstwhile far-right allies. President Emmanuel Macron and the philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy denounced him by name, which also served as a slight to Ms. Le Pen, and 5 current and former presidents of the French Parliament signed an angry op-ed condemning his unwanted meddling. To fight a Europe held responsible for all our woes, we're supposed to follow the orders delivered from a suite at a luxurious Paris hotel by a shadowy advisor to Donald Trump, recycled as a freelance lobbyist for the Populist International, they wrote. "The nation, united, will not take orders," they said. Trying to drum up support for his own forces, Mr. Macron told local journalists that he saw for the first time connivance between the nationalists and foreign interests, whose goal is dismantling Europe. Lobbyists like Mr. Bannon, close to the American executive, are saying it, he said. In fact, the far-right's ties to Mr. Bannon had handed Mr. Macron a golden opportunity to depict Ms. Le Pen's party as controlled by foreigners. That is an odd and vulnerable place for a nationalist party to be, except there's no shame, so they probably won't feel it. "There is a strong, persistent anti-American vein," said Jean-Yves Camus, an expert on far-right movements at the Fondation, I don't know how they say the T-I-O-N, the foundation, I guess, Jean Jaurès, I guess. Terrible with French. The Research Institute in Paris. And a great way to hit the national rally is to portray it as the double foreigners party, American and Russian. No winners there. Mr. Levy, for his part, stood on the steps of the, remember this one, Élysée Palace, after a lunch with President Macron, declaring himself upset to see Europe, quote, corrupted from the inside by little populist thugs manipulated by Mr. Bannon, unquote. Mr. Bannon chuckled. French guys throwing their toys out of the pram, he said, because pram, he's so English. He's so continental now. Mr. Bannon is pram. The disdain is strictly mutual. Mr. Bannon concentrated much of his fire on Mr. Macron, insisting that the French leader was going to lose big in the European Parliament elections. And I do think he did. I don't know how big. He lost, though, as far as I'm able to tell. Or at least from what I gathered. Maybe I read it wrong. I still don't think I have a firm grip on what happened. We'll turn back to it tomorrow. Macron, he said, is a product of the system. Boo, system. Rawr. The globalist system, of course, of free-moving capital that had betrayed working-class voters, valiantly championed by Mr. Trump, no way, in Mr. Bannon's restless farrago. Wow. As for himself, I totally identify with the Gilets jaunes. Remember them? Mr. Bannon said, of course, why not? Referring to the yellow vest protesters whose often violent demonstrations over low wages and diminished expectations rocked Macron's presidency for 6 months. Mr. Bannon seemed to overlook the fact that the yellow vests have destroyed and vandalized symbols of excessive wealth in the heart of the capital. Had they been allowed anywhere near the Bristol, 2 blocks from the Élysée Palace, in one of the most heavily protected zones of Paris, they might have trashed it. We don't know. Sometimes they don't care about hypocrisy. That's possible. I don't know whether the Gilets jaunes are anything like American MAGA populists, but some of them certainly seem to have some similarities, although others more closely resemble the Occupy protesters than anything else, which just tells me that it's not any kind of a cohesive movement that we understand, though it may make perfect sense in France. I cannot promise you I understand French politics. All right. Let's see. I mentioned that there were a couple of things I had seen on Twitter which were of some interest and played off of that piece. I've got to scroll down and see if I can find them. Yes, and here's one of them from Zeddary, Zeddary, who currently explains compliments the moniker as Zedediah Springfield. This from, about 19 hours ago now, so yesterday. People can scream hypocrisy, but this, we'll find out which this is, but this is precisely the world that Trump, Farage, Putin, MBS et al. Seek to build. A powerful elite that can freely mingle, travel, hide vast wealth in each other's countries, but hard borders and cruel nationalism for everyone else. And a great term coined here, great coinage, jet-set fascism. And I mean, how could you fail to follow up on the story of Steve Bannon holding court at a fancy Paris hotel on behalf of an international anti-globalist populist movement, but by citing jet-set fascism. The tweet from Zeddary here includes another tweet quoted entry here from Brian Whitaker. Let's pull that one up and get the info on that. Brian Whitaker is a journalist and former Middle East editor of The Guardian newspaper in the UK. And the tweet he selected here is one noting a Brexit party candidate. Remember them? Remember the European parliamentary elections. A Brexit party candidate who lives in the south of France, has been elected to represent the northeast of England in the European Parliament. How do you like them palms, I guess? Or is that potatoes? So what's apple? I don't remember. How do you like them apples? If only I spoke French, I could help you. I know it in Spanish. It's manzana, right? Well, that's no help. Anyway, that's clearly not it. Now that I'm thinking about it, isn't it pommes frites? There's French fries to us, but okay. Apple. Somebody give me the word for that. All right. One of you Canadians must know it. So it's connected to this article about you want to find out about the guy, or should we read the tweet storm first? Let's open up that article and see if we can get back to it later on. But it's a very interesting. How do you like that? He lives in the south of France, but he's run for office based in the UK, which I guess he can do by virtue of the European Union's general scheme of things. But he's running as a Brexit candidate, so I don't know what to tell you. It's just dumb, top to bottom, and they don't care. That's the point that Zeddery here is making, is that the charge of hypocrisy doesn't bother them anyway, so they just, bulldoze right past it. So people can scream hypocrisy, but this is precisely the world that these kind of guys seek to build. Powerful elite that can freely mingle, travel, hide vast wealth in each other's countries, etc. But hard borders and cruel nationalism for everyone else. Jet-set fascism. They know damn well the benefits of an interconnected world. Certainly Bannon does, right? He's seeking to exploit it right now. They only seek to keep it for themselves. And the extreme of it is when autocrats use that privileged global freedom to silence dissent. Khashoggi, Novichok, Erdogan's assault on protesters in D.C. All infinitely greater violations of sovereignty than any migrant desperate to live, met with little scorn from Trump and others. Okay, so how do you like that? I thought that was a pretty good point and well taken. I think there were probably a few more. What else do I have in mind here? I think that actually encapsulated both of the thoughts that I had as I was reading through the piece on the on Bannon here. But maybe now would be a good time. Let's just take a look at who's this guy from the Brexit party. The coverage in the Independent here by Tom Embury Dennis here. Height of hypocrisy, as if that bothered them. New Brexit Party MEP for Northeast England lives in the south of France. It is Palm, is that right? Okay, Scott tells me. So what am I thinking of? Oh, potatoes are pomme de terre. Is that right? Michael Musson tells me. Palms is apples. Pommes de terre is potatoes. See? France, please. Okay, well, it makes some sense. Pomme de terre, ground apples. Okay, or earth apples. Which would you prefer as the translation there? All right, well, okay. At least I figured that was in my head for some reason, but I just thought huge idiotic mistake was the reason. But apparently, minor idiotic mistake is what put it there. Okay. So what are we looking at here? A Brexit Party candidate who lives in the south of France, has been elected to represent the northeast of England in the European Parliament. Brian Monteith, Monteith, a former Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament, is one of two pro-Brexit candidates to win in the region, after Nigel Farage's insurgent party pulled off a major victory in the EU elections on Sunday night. He will be joined in Brussels by John Tennant, a former aide to Mr. Farage, that sounds bad, who once praised a UKIP MEP for using a Nazi slogan to insult a German colleague. You pwned the Germans. That's, I guess, how you got elected there. Jude Curtin Darling. It's Kirton hyphen Darling. I love those hyphenated names over in England. A Labour MEP who retained the region's third and final seat said voters had elected, quote, a man who cares not for this region. That's strong words, I guess. I think it's the height of hypocrisy that somebody who's standing on a platform to remove free movement from the young people of this area actually benefits himself from free movement by living in France and commuting between London and his home in France for work, she said. Yeah, and it is, but that just doesn't bother them, so that's the way it goes. In a notice of election, which includes all candidates' addresses, Mr. Monteith is listed as living in Trevien. I'm guessing Trevien, a village with fewer than 200 residents, according to a 2016 census. Sounds hotsy-totsy. Mr. Monteith, who was branded a Thatcherite Scottish Tory by UKIP's lead Northeast candidate Richard Elvin, told The Guardian it was not unusual to live in a country different than the one in which you are seeking election. I think it probably is. And said he was now moving back to Britain. In a region which strongly backed Leave in the 2016 referendum, the Brexit Party's success there came as no surprise. Mr. Farage's party won 240,056 votes, more than twice as many as Labour, 119,931, in second, and the Liberal Democrats with 104,330 in third. The Conservatives got 42,395 and finished fifth, behind the Greens, 49,905, and only just ahead of UKIP, 38,269. Change UK, 24,968, came in a distant seventh. Boy, that's near meaningless to me at the moment, but I think we could probably untangle that tomorrow with Greg's help, and probably help from all the rest of you as well. Thanks for your French tutoring. I appreciate it. Okay, let's just park that in pocket so I can provide you all with the link later. What else did this remind me of? There was another election tweet that I saw go by. Oh, yeah, and I think it was Carol Cadwalader who had, whose name I still haven't checked out the pronunciation of, that tweeted this one around. I got to scroll a little bit further back, but I think one of the observations she had made was that, there it is, in case we missed this particular triumph for democracy, as she puts it. Let's open this one up. She tweeted the other day, exciting, Cambridge Analytica's Alexandra Phillips is now a member of the European Parliament. Cambridge Analytica holding a seat now in the European Parliament. That can only go well. Okay. And by the way, interesting development here, not often seen. There were, in fact, two different candidates by the name of Alexandra Phillips running for that seat. One as a member of the Brexit Party, the one we're talking about, and one as a member of the Greens. So that's a little confusing, and I'm not certain whether that was anybody's plan or not, but it's unusual, I think, to say the least. All right, so two tidbits from the European parliamentary elections is about as much on that subject as I can handle without doing some offline research in between then and now, and maybe that's how I'll be spending at least part of my time between today's show and tomorrow's. All right, back to Pocket to see what else we can pick out to share for you here. Yes, heading into the weekend, this is sort of like, I don't know if anybody needs any reminding of this one, but I guess maybe to set the table for more Trump news during the rest of the week, I have Brian Beutler's piece. It's always wise to recap with Brian here. The guardrails have failed. I think you probably know what's coming in this piece, but let's just tick off some of his recounting and thinking. He very often organizes things for us in useful ways. For all it lacks in urgency, the rote approach House Democrats, yes, remember those guys, have taken to investigating President Trump appeared, at least briefly this week, meaning last week, to be overwhelming him. There was some evidence of movement here. Trump abruptly threatened to harm the public interest on Wednesday unless Democrats ceased their inquiries, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi attributed his meltdown to the fact that her efforts are dragging his finances slowly into the public light. That, of course, his threat not to work with anybody or sign any infrastructure bills because Democrats were being mean to him, harm the public interest because of that, unless they ceased their inquiries. There is some truth to her assessment, that is, Pelosi's assessment that she's causing a meltdown. 2 federal judges last week, I'll amend, upheld subpoenas Democrats have issued to Trump's accountants and lenders seeking his financial information. You remember those stories. New York State, of course, passed legislation that will allow Congress to obtain his state tax returns. The House Intelligence Committee just secured access to counterintelligence findings of the Russia investigation, which may include financial information. And the Washington Post revealed that the government's tax lawyers believe the IRS will ultimately have to turn 6 years of Trump's tax returns over to Congress. Update on that, by the way. Where's the lawsuit? We are still waiting for Richard Neal and the Ways and Means Committee to file their suit, despite the fact that we got these 2 rulings that seem to imply it should be open and shut over on the tax returns case. It still hasn't happened. I'm sure they're taking their time and crossing T's and dotting I's, but boy, we'd like to see those things ready to go before we open our mouths. House Democrats aren't checking Trump as aggressively as they could, but Pelosi pointed to these developments as evidence that even proceeding with caution, the gravitational pull of the legislative and judicial processes will inevitably pry Trump's most closely held secrets loose and into the public domain. Her vindication was short-lived. By Thursday night, all the dangerous shortcomings of the slow-going approach had reasserted themselves. And they suggest that the normal oversight process will be sufficient to protect the rule of law, but that the institutional guardrails surrounding the rule of law are faltering all at once, and more aggressively than at any time since Trump won the presidency. The most alarming news came in an announcement from the White House press secretary that Trump had granted Attorney General William Barr the unilateral authority to declassify any information about the Russia investigators that he wants, including, reportedly, their sources in Russia. The breach here is stunning and would normally generate a rebellion within the intelligence community, whose leaders are expected to be fiercely jealous guardians of their agency's sources, methods, and other equities. It has instead generated no pushback. Barr's new powers are even more alarming because of what kind of man we know he is. He's repeatedly abused his existing powers to help Trump and threaten Democrats politically through the selective release of information designed to mislead the public. We should expect him to use this new power to frame Trump's political enemies, most of whom will be legally obligated not to defend themselves, right? Don't forget that part. This wouldn't be such a troubling risk were really other institutional counterweights holding up well, but the national media has thus far proven to be an easy mark for Barr and has shown little indication that it will treat his pronouncements with the extreme skepticism they deserve. In fact, just this morning I saw people tweeting about another egregious New York Times headline in which they claimed, baselessly enough, that Barr's addition to the DOJ was somehow going to professionalize the operation, which it actually does the opposite of professionalizing it. It politicizes it. Democrats in Congress could also neutralize this threat. Certain congressional leaders are entitled to view all intelligence Barr is about to receive and are immunized by the Constitution to disclose all of it. This would be a drastic step, but more than justified, both to protect Trump's targets from selective smearing or prosecution and to prevent the Trump administration from deploying the findings of the intelligence services for partisan political advantage. But nothing Democrats have done since Trump came to power suggests they have the fortitude to do something so extraordinary, and they will likely bind themselves to norms Trump and Barr have gleefully jettisoned. By not acting more aggressively, House Democrats created an incentive for Trump and others to run roughshod over them. On Thursday, the Washington Post noticed the bottom feeders of the online world, online right in particular, circulating footage of Nancy Pelosi that had been doctored to make her appear drunk. By Thursday night, Republicans, including Trump and his servants on Fox News, were engaged in a coordinated effort to spread similarly doctored disinformation, confident that social media companies would not step in to remove the footage, as indeed they have not. At least not before millions of people had seen it, and that House Democrats would not move with any urgency to shame those companies. Just as they did 3 years ago, every institutional leader who has been beseeched to take the threat to democracy more seriously has taken false solace in the polls, which for now show Trump losing to every leading Democratic presidential primary contender. What could go wrong? Good question, always. Repeatedly, over and over. Same question we always ask, and same question we always are surprised by the answer by. We'll be right back. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Let's continue with Brian Beutler's piece in Crooked from last week, recapping basically all the failures of the guardrails, as he put it, all collapsing at once. We left off by noting that just as they did 3 years ago, every institutional leader who has been beseeched to take the threat to democracy more seriously has taken false solace in the polls, which for now show Trump losing to every leading Democratic presidential primary contender. What could go wrong? We wonder. For a time, the growing number of anxious Democrats who support impeachment hoped that dramatic public testimony from Special Counsel Robert Mueller would galvanize the public and the party to their side, allowing Democrats to seize narrative control over the Russia investigation and the broader question of public corruption back from Trump. Thursday night, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler acknowledged that this is unlikely to happen. According to Nadler, Mueller is reluctant to testify publicly and has only agreed to testify in closed session, after which Nadler would be allowed to release the transcript of the proceedings, another multi-hundred-page document almost nobody in the country will read. It's unclear whether Nadler has agreed to those terms, but the approach Democrats have settled upon strips him of almost all of his leverage. Nadler can threaten to subpoena Mueller, but Mueller remains a DOJ employee and is thus bound by constraints Barr might place on his testimony. Once he's a private citizen again, those constraints could be lifted, but Mueller can simply hold on to his appointment until Nadler agrees to his conditions. It's been 2 months since Mueller completed his report, and in working desperately to keep Congress off the path to impeachment, Nadler has managed to secure testimony from 0 witnesses about it. By contrast, former FBI Director James Comey appeared on Capitol Hill to testify 2 days after he concluded the Clinton email investigation. Nadler could have subpoenaed other Mueller investigators, right, who have moved on to private life. He could have opened an impeachment inquiry, which would give him a forceful legal argument that he's entitled to all the testimony and documentation he needs to determine whether the House should recommend Trump be removed from office. Democrats have decided instead to seek piecemeal rulings from courts that won't actually yield any disclosures, at least until Trump has exhausted his appeals. Impeachment advocates worried all along that the Democrats' dithering and self-doubt would create a number of perverse consequences, that the public would interpret their irresolution as a sign that Trump's presidency is not a crisis, that Trump himself would fill the void of inaction with propaganda and defamation and selective prosecution, exacerbating public confusion when the truth is actually quite simple. These fears are all rapidly materializing And the fact that the Democratic approach is failing has yet to dawn on anyone who has the power to change course. A rather harsh assessment, but I think a relatively accurate one, and a good reminder as we get back to live shows for the week that it's your job, even if you support Nancy Pelosi in all of this, is to publicly push for more and more aggressive pushback from Democrats, whether that reaches the level of impeachment or not. You're supposed to help keep the fire under her lit. I believe, and if you support her, you probably believe that's actually what she wants. Whether she has a plan to arrive at impeachment at some later point or not, surely she wants public pressure for more investigation to continue, and that will be your job. All right. Let's see. Other items that make sense to share with you. Let's see. Let's click in on a few more of these that were left over from last week. You've probably imagined that we've covered this topic relatively well, but once again, we will depend on someone else's outside organization of thought for us, and in using this article to clarify our thinking and reset where we are for the coming week. Arthur Delaney wrote this piece for HuffPost last week. The Trumpification of the IRS. Behold, we are instructed to behold the many ways Donald Trump has bent the agency to his will. Let's take a look. The Internal Revenue Service is starting to look like the partisan tool that Republicans accused it of being during the Barack Obama administration. Once again, projection at the heart of everything they do. The Donald Trump administration has assumed more control than its predecessors over how the agency writes tax regulations, has ordered unpaid IRS workers to process tax refunds during the government shutdown, has intervened to block Democrats' request for the president's tax returns, and, as we learned last week, buried a staff memo outlining how the agency should respond to such requests. Under federal law, when certain members of Congress ask for private tax information, the IRS has no choice but to hand it over, according to that legal analysis, which the Washington Post exposed last Tuesday. That's contrary to the administration's position, gee whiz, which is that the disclosure would be unconstitutional. An IRS spokesperson said that the memo is not the agency's position, that it hadn't been finalized, that Commissioner Charles Rettig hadn't seen it before, and that the IRS never sent the document to its parent agency, the Treasury Department. The memo was written by unnamed staffers sometime in the fall, when the prospect of Democrats retaking the House of Representatives and using their power to seek Trump's taxes was already a major news story. The president has long refused to make his returns public. I suspect that the memo was not drafted by a summer intern, said Jeff Hauser, director of the Revolving Door Project, an anti-corruption initiative of the Liberal Center for Economic and Policy Research. Democrats asked last month for 6 years of Trump's personal and business tax returns. That phone's supposed to be off, ladies and gentlemen. Apparently not. Only to have the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, rebuff their request, even though the request was addressed not to him but to Rettig, since it's the commissioner who traditionally handles requests for private tax information. The tax code says that if the Treasury Secretary wants to step in and enforce tax laws himself, he's supposed to give Congress 30 days notice that he plans to revoke responsibilities previously delegated to the commissioner. Mnuchin did not give any notice before taking command of the tax return request, nor has he justified not giving notice. In response to queries from Democrats at committee hearings, both Mnuchin and Rettig have simply said that the Treasury supervises the IRS, and Rettig has said little else. Charles Rettig has taped his mouth, or maybe Mnuchin taped his mouth. Representative Bill Pascrell, Democrat of New Jersey, a member of the Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee, told HuffPost last week he's out of the picture. He's irrelevant. Treasury's big footing of the tax return request is typical of how the Trump administration has treated the IRS, said Mark Mazur, a former Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy at Treasury and current co-director of the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center. What you're seeing here is much more of the smaller decisions being run through a process that includes people outside the IRS, Mazur said. In another example of the Trumpification of the IRS, the White House assumed more power over tax regulation so it could control implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the president's biggest legislative accomplishment. Since the Ronald Reagan administration, tax regulations have essentially been exempt from central control by the White House's Office of Management and Budget, which has final say on most agencies' regulations. On an April 2018 Memorandum of Understanding between Treasury and OMB brought tax regulation under close control of the White House. Record requests from reporters at Tax Notes reveal the administration's hand in several new rules, including one designed to stop Democratic state legislatures from dodging the law's limit on state and local tax deductions. The rushed tax law exemplifies the sort of slapdash governance that is a hallmark of Trumpism. After the law passed at the end of 2017, the IRS needed to update the tables that employers use to withhold federal income tax from their workers' paychecks. You all remember this episode. Republicans had scrambled the deductions underlying the tables, but instead of coming up with a new formula and giving employers time to adjust, Treasury told the IRS to go ahead with the old tables, even though the department knew doing so might result in more workers owing money at tax time. So far, 1 million fewer households have gotten refunds this year. Of course, the IRS is not an independent agency. It's run by a political appointee and has not been immune from claims of partisan bias. During the Obama administration, Republicans accused the IRS of excessively questioning conservative groups that wanted the agency to certify their nonprofit status. Republicans were so mad that in 2014 they used the federal tax disclosure law, the same one Democrats are now using to ask for Trump's taxes, to obtain and expose the private tax information of several dozen entities as part of a report referring an IRS official to the Justice Department for prosecution. An internal watchdog's investigation later revealed that the IRS had also improperly targeted liberal groups. But improper, I guess the operative word there. The fight over Trump's tax returns, I don't even think it was all that improper now that I think about it, but we've discussed why in the past. The fight over Trump's tax returns is just one part of a broader battle between Congress and the administration, which has argued that it should not be subject to any oversight at all because Democrats only care about tearing down the president. More Democrats came out in favor of starting impeachment proceedings against the president last week, as administration officials continued to defy subpoenas requesting documents and testimony. Representative Dan Kildee of Michigan, an ally of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, has been skeptical of impeachment, which the Speaker thinks would be a tactical mistake. But Kildee said last week that the hidden IRS memo regarding tax return requests had made him more open to the idea. It sort of begs the question of the larger issue we're trying to examine, and that's whether the president is somehow unduly influencing the IRS, Kildee said. The IRS automatically audits the president every year, so of course he can't release those taxes because he's under audit, right? And in other words, every president who ever released his taxes as president was doing so despite the fact that there was an audit going on, but never mind all that. Simple answer, so forget it, we'll focus on other things. Anyway, IRS automatically audits the president every year, and Democrats base their request for Trump's taxes on a need to evaluate the scope of the audit. The IRS memo said the law does not allow for discretion as to whether to comply with a proper request for returns or return information, but the Trump administration has given itself that discretion. All he's doing now is reinforcing our suspicion that he might be unduly trying to influence the IRS, Kildee said. And there we are at the end of that particular piece and able to move on to others. Let me just make a quick check through on what's going on some of our other input channels here, aside from all of your help with French pronunciation and other story ideas. Yes, I guess we'll just throw this one out here. Thanks very much to Darwin Darko for sending us this one. I did forget this in our recap of events in Japan. Just, I guess, ought to point out 2 people killed and at least 17 others injured in a mass stabbing event at some point that took place near Tokyo. I mean, unclear whether there's any connection at all, honestly, between, well, the stabbing and anything in particular. The motive for the attack just apparently remains unknown, but just a weird coincidence or something else, not really sure, but we ought to at least acknowledge that took place. If we can't keep track of mass attacks here in the United States, we can at least keep track of them in whatever country the president is traveling in at the time, I guess, and keep track of things that way. Let's see. There was, I guess, also over the weekend, the development of that weird right-wing GoFundMe effort to build some portion of Trump's wall that we learned last week was, I guess there were some accusations last week that the whole thing was fraudulent and the guy had been buying himself luxury items with the money. And so I guess possibly in response, they held an emergency construction party. Yahoo News reported it this way. Why this is datelined Barcelona, Spain, I simply am not sure. Let's see. Unless were they talking to Bannon about it? What's going on here? Yeah, well, because Bannon, as you know, is connected to this group that was raising the money to build the wall. And as a matter of fact, Yahoo's headline from Melissa Rossi reads, Bannon's group built the wall, a mile of it anyway, over the weekend. And I did see some other people tweeting about this, and there was some important detail about that, which I'll throw out right up top before even turning to see whether Yahoo covers it or not. But apparently they found a section of the border area where I guess a friendly landowner offered up their own private property for the construction project, and they're considerably, removed, relatively speaking, from the border itself. So, in other words, the wall wasn't built on the border. It was built on the private property of somebody who wants there to be a wall, but never bothered to build a wall themselves, and has now taken everybody else's money to build a mile of unsupported on either side fencing on their own property. So I don't know that really answers the question of this funding being used for private gain, but there you have it. So I guess now over to the Yahoo coverage. Again, datelined in Barcelona. That must have been where Bannon was. In what might be seen as a Memorial Day gift to President Trump, residents of a mountain range outside of El Paso today woke up to a new vista, a mile-long wall of metal slats constructed along the border with Mexico that just shot up over the weekend. The secret project, which started on Friday evening and was completed by Monday morning, was the work of We Build the Wall, a new group whose director is the former White House strategist Steve Bannon. The CEO is Air Force veteran Brian Colfage. He's the guy accused of taking the money and buying yachts with it, who had raised $20 million to build the wall through his GoFundMe project, but it appeared to be floundering until Bannon took the helm. Bannon, who for much of the weekend was in Kazakhstan, of all places, for a geopolitical seminar, why, I don't know, says the project, overseen by construction mogul Tommy Fisher of North Dakota-based Fisher Industries, I wonder if that's the guy who Trump has been trying to steer the contracts to, involved hundreds of workers and cost $6 million. I guess we can actually check in on that relatively quickly because I have the Washington Post piece from last week close enough at hand that if I can scroll through, we might be able to see if we turn up Fisher's name in all of this. Not so. There he is. Fisher. There we go. So that's the guy. So I guess after negative publicity about trying to steer contracts to him and negative publicity about Kolfage stealing the money, Bannon gave direction from Barcelona and or Kazakhstan that the construction ought to take place over the weekend. And here, plop down $6 million of the 20 and build a mile-long stretch of wall on some guy's property. So, where were we? We were with Bannon and Fisher here. Who's speaking in this case? Bannon, for much of the weekend, was in Kazakhstan. Said the project, overseen by Tommy Fisher, involved all the hundreds of workers, $6 million cost. He said the group asked local authorities, what is the most dangerous part of the border with Mexico? And they were pointed to this precarious mountain strip. Quote, where the cartels and asylum seekers are coming in, unquote. Nice conflation there. Both cartels and asylum seekers, because we need to be afraid of the asylum seekers. They're the ones who are actually coming. Cartels sound scarier, so we'll just talk about them. Come in through a gap between two 21-mile strips of completed wall. Maybe. The group hastily, quote, purchased the rights, unquote, to the land and went at it Friday evening. We had to catch them by surprise, says Bannon, who predicts residents are, quote, gonna freak out, unquote, when they see what was erected over the past 2 days. A private landowner has put up a very large fence. Yikes. Perhaps construction is Bannon's new calling. His political activities in Europe, geared to shift the EU to the hard right, didn't go as well as anticipated in parliamentary elections this weekend. The nationalist and populist parties he's been advising across the continent, among them Italy's La Lega, headed by Matteo Salvini, and France's National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen, did make gains in elections. Both parties came in first in their respective countries, with National Rally beating out the La République En Marche party of French President Emmanuel Macron. Because there was French in there, I had to make it a stilted read. That's the way you know that I don't know French. Just reminding you. However, others, such as Dutchman Geert Wilders' anti-Islam Party of Freedom, were trounced, losing all 4 of their currently held parliament seats. The Bannon-advised anti-immigrant, anti-abortion Vox Party, a newcomer in Spain, which took 10% in last month's national elections, scored scarcely 6% in this weekend's elections. Most EU countries saw a record turnout of over 50%. In total, the hard-right parties that Bannon had predicted would take at least 30% of seats. At points, he suggested they might take half of the parliament, causing an earthquake for the European Union. Instead, won scarcely 25% of seats. While the showing represented an increase over the 22% they gained in the 2014 elections, it fell short of the 1/3 of the European Parliament's 751 seats that would be required to form a bloc that could effectively hinder legislation and nominate to the higher ranks of the EU. So we at least have, I guess, those reports of results coming in. But yeah, this build the wall thing, essentially, as we heard elsewhere, and I'll see if I can find the tweets about it, they basically found a cooperative landowner who was in the vicinity, anyway, of the border, and for whatever reason, opted to allow people to just build a mile of border wall looking fencing on his property. And, the guy may be perfectly pleased to have that on his property. That's not in question. I guess the question is whether it makes any sense and whether it's proper usage of the money. I guess since it's private money, it could be used in any number of ways. And MAGA types who donated it would likely be happy with the outcome. Look, there's fencing here, and if it protects this wall supporter's personal property, I guess they're not going to object to it, but it is something that this guy could have built at any time, being pro-wall as he is, and paranoid about the flow of migrants and allegedly drug cartels as well across his land or nearby. He could have put up fencing at any time to protect his property, but he waited to tap the $20 million in reserves that the other suckers had put up in order to build the fencing he always wanted. Magically, it showed up for free on his doorstep. Okay, well, very interesting. And worth noting. Let's see. One more thing, I guess, that we can try and squeeze in here. I think there's been developments on this front since, but last week we were served notice by the folks at Media Matters that, and Greg mentioned this as well, that Ken Cuccinelli from my own state of Virginia here, apparently being held up as a potential DHS, what shall we say? Was he being offered the head of DHS or just a senior position in DHS overseeing immigration? Media Matters puts it this way. Potential DHS senior official Ken Cuccinelli suggested that states invoke war powers to turn back migrant invasion. Now, we've heard migrants being referred to as an invasion before. What about this war powers thing? Did you wonder what he was talking about? Cuccinelli saying here, because states would be acting under war powers, there's no due process. You just point them, the migrants, back across the river and let them swim for it. According to Eric Hananoki, who reports here again for Media Matters. Ken Cuccinelli, President Donald Trump's likely pick for a senior position at the Department of Homeland Security, previously told Breitbart.com that states could invoke war powers against migrants crossing the U.S. southern border because, quote, it's an invasion, unquote. It just is. He added that doing so would mean there's no due process and states could point them back across the river and let them swim for it. Now, Trump is reportedly set to hire Cuccinelli, a former, here's how they describe him, as a former CNN commentator, and Virginia Attorney General, to a senior position at DHS where he would coordinate immigration policy. Media Matters recently documented Cuccinelli's long anti-LGBTQ record. Cuccinelli has got a history of pushing anti-immigrant policies and rhetoric, including comparing undocumented immigrants to rats and opposing birthright citizenship. Now, since his name had been bandied about, it has turned out that he has not got the support of Mitch McConnell, which would sort of be critical in this. Not because, of course, that Cuccinelli's thoughts and comments and record go too far for the delicately mannered Mitch McConnell, but rather that at some point Ken Cuccinelli, in attempting to become more of a Trumpist-type Tea Party darling, ended up throwing his backing to a primary opponent from the right against Mitch McConnell in seeking re-election. So it's a personal grudge, in other words, that keeps McConnell from agreeing to Cuccinelli's appointment here. So I don't know whether we have official word about it having been withdrawn or anything, but apparently the prospects are not good. But if you were wondering about that, now states and war powers, that seems like the sort of thing that maybe states wouldn't have. War powers would appear in most people's minds to be something that would belong to the federal government. But as it happens, there is, in fact, a reservation to the states of the ability to act on its own in the case of an actual invasion. And I guess some question about whether or not the invasion is actual enough to satisfy who? I guess the Supreme Court. You would have to make further inquiries. But yeah, in one of the parts of the Constitution, not frequently studied and just doesn't come up all that often, Article 4, Section 4 has got that. The United States, of course, shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government, which I would not be surprised if at some point Donald Trump took to mean a Republican Party-dominated government. It says right there that it has to be Republican. Anyway, it also says it shall protect each of them against invasion. And, well, if we don't hold up to that, apparently the states can exercise their own discretion when they are actually, in their opinion, under invasion. There's actually, and now I've lost my bookmark here of the actual section that we're discussing, but okay, there you have it. It's in there. I promise. I have looked it up. I've read it, and it appears to be a real thing. It's just not much talked about because we're just so rarely invaded. Okay, well, at any rate, let's time now to turn things over to Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy coming up next. We'll try and squeeze in a little bit of what he's got on tap for you next.
From Daily Co's Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, of course, he'll be recapping everything that happened in Japan. No need to worry about that in case you wanted some more details. Let's see. Representative Rashida Tlaib says impeaching Trump is not about what will happen in 2020, but about what is right now for our country. No surprise there, but I'm glad she's saying it. I'm glad justice repeats it.